the stream is good and healthy before I really dive into it. Have had some issues lately with the stream and getting things kicked off in the right way. So if you are in chat and you can hear me and you can see me okay, just send me a little chat message real quick. I've got my eyes on chat to make sure that the stream is successfully up and running. I did just get out of the webinar from Cisco about what is on the CCIE Enterprise exam. And this is all part of the CCIE journey, and this was the webinar that I was most excited about. This was the webinar about how to prep for the CCIE Enterprise, and I felt like if I was going to have a change in strategy, it was going to come after this webinar. I think the first thing I can dive into and say right now, I don't feel like my strategy has changed at this point. I feel like my strategy is going to be about the same, but they did say a lot of things. I took a lot of notes. They did say a lot of things that I think were pretty interesting, kind of peculiar. Let's dive into it, shall we? The first thing they said is that what was their motivation for doing this? This was changing away from route switch towards now enterprise. They said that route switch was heavily focused on routing and switching and not necessarily specific to the environment that you're going to work in. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to take parts of route switch out that were relevant to enterprises and put that in the enterprise exam. Parts of service provider out and put that towards service provider. The big thing that they highlighted that they kept harping on there was ISIS. They said ISIS was more of a service provider topic and not so much enterprise. I'm not going to say they walked back on that later, but when they initially said that, I was like, okay, cool. ISIS isn't on the exam, or really not in a way that I need to know it. Then later, somebody asked, well, wait a minute, SD-Access is comprised of ISIS, VXLAN, and Lisp. Do I need to know those? What they said was you don't need to know how to configure them from the command line, but you would want to know how they work. You would want to know how they work in relation to an SD-Access fabric. You would want to know your show commands if you're asked to troubleshoot something with, say, ISIS or VXLAN or Lisp. And then you would want to know how to implement them, and then they said specifically from the DNA Center front end. So it's not like, okay, if I see an ISIS chapter, just skip it entirely now. It is, I want to know how it's designed, how it works, and then the show commands to verify it, but I won't be asked to jump on a command line and implement it. So anyways, the big thing that they said is that almost all of the topics from route switch did make their way into this. And at that point, I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. That means this is not only the CCIE route switch exam, this is the CCIE route switch exam plus SD whatever, SD-Access, SD-WAN, plus programmability and automation. And they brought that topic up. They said, you may be thinking now this is the route switch exam now bloated with SD whatever and with automation. And they said, and you'd be exactly right. At that point, my head was like blown. So that is some pretty interesting stuff. But I knew this at that same time. I think in a previous stream, I said that I wanted to be Keith Barker levels of good at networking and routing and switching. That hasn't changed. The majority of my textbooks, if you look at the pages out of all the textbooks that I purchased, the majority of those textbooks are centered around the networking portion, the core networking with routing and switching. And I think my focus is still heavily on that. Even though it only counts for 30% of the exam, it's still now heavily... In fact, you know what? Let's do this. Let's bring up the actual page here, the exam blueprint. Yeah, here we go. This is way better. So... where's my pen? There's my pen. Yeah, so they did talk about, keep in mind how much these are weighted. They harped a lot on the fact that SD-WAN, SD-Access, and automation are, where people are stressed out about right now. So if I actually collapse this, and kind of scroll, well, I can't get those back. Okay, so they harped on how domain 2 here and domain 5 are what people are stressed about, but they're like, keep that in perspective. It's not that big of a thing. They were like, programmability is only 15% of the exam, so don't feel like you have to master it. They said you want to know basic Python, basic API fundamentals, and interestingly, with regard to automation and networking, they said you want to know the request library, the NC client library for netconf, and Postman. They also said that your tasks will not dictate which tool you use. They said you could use Postman to perform the task or Python to perform the task. But I thought it was interesting the way they said you're going to be graded on the Python script. the Python script is going to make a configuration change, right? It's going to maybe to set a description on an interface, something like that, to make something up. What they're going to do, once you're done, once you've left, they're going to go in and they're going to wipe out that config change, run your script again, and verify that the script does what you were told to do. And I thought that was pretty cool. They don't care about the code itself. They don't care how good at best practices you are. They don't care if you know functions or classes. They don't care. They just want to know, does your script work? And I appreciate that because a lot of network engineers are not software developers, and they're not pretentious about coding best practices. They just want something that works. And that's how you're going to be graded in the lab exam. I thought that was really cool. To that point, they did say if you don't use the DevNet sandbox and get hands-on and practice the networking and automation, they said, we don't believe there's a way you will pass this exam if you don't know these things, which I think was kind of a mixed signal, because there was when they said, keep it in mind, it's only 15% of the exam. Don't stress yourself out of it. Then they turn around and say, like, if you don't practice, you're going to fail. So it's like, okay. I guess we do need to, take this stuff very seriously, even if it's only 15% of the exam. So there was that. The flip side of that, they also stressed that SD-WAN and SD-Access were only 25% of the exam, and they stressed that you really only need to know the basics of how to use these technologies to perform basic tasks. They did list off a couple tasks. I need to look at my documentation here. There's no focus on DNA Center outside of the features that are related to SD-Access. So I thought that was particularly interesting. I took that as things like maybe I won't need to know how to use assurance to troubleshoot like client health issues unless it's specific to SD-Access. They said there's no focus on ISE aside from basic interaction with it. You'll be provided with a pre-configured ISE. You can access it, you can poke around in it, but you won't have to change anything in ISE. So I thought that was interesting too. They kept referring to this section in Domain 2 as just know the basics, and they said if you have a fundamental grasp of the basics, you have an excellent chance of passing this domain. And then they listed off 2 or 3 tasks, or like, for example, if you can do this and this and this, you'll probably be good. And those things to me personally didn't sound very basic. They mentioned something like if you can perform route leaking on SD-WAN, or if you can configure BGP between SD-WAN and DNA Center, or from DNA Center, you would be good. I guess those would be fundamental tasks for those tools, but for someone coming into this studying plan who's never touched DNA Center or SD-WAN, you'd probably feel very stressed out about that right now. That being said, because of what they said, that you just need to know how to use these tools, you don't need to be experts or masters in them, they're new tools. So therefore, they should be treated like new tools in this exam. I feel very comfortable that recording and practicing and labbing the CCNP level topics of those, like the ENSDWI for SD-WAN, I feel very comfortable that that will prepare me for this exam. My stress, another interesting one, Domain 3, let's bring this up. DMVPN, you see all this stuff DMVPN right here. When they say troubleshoot DMVPN, they mean troubleshoot. There is no design and deploy in DMVPN. They said you're going to get a pre-configured DMVPN scenario that's going to be broken, so you'll have to troubleshoot it. And then they also pointed out this Flex VPN, the action verb here is identify use cases. So that means this is going to come up in the design module. It won't be in deploy, operate, and optimize. So interesting things that they talked about there. One of the questions that I asked during this live stream that I did not get an answer for was with regard to the MPLS section. I wanted to verify that this isn't just troubleshooting. This is deploy, operate, optimize. They didn't answer that, but I feel pretty confident that it is deploy, operate, optimize. You will need to know how to configure it because it's not explicitly calling out a troubleshoot or an identify. Oh, let me go ahead and make sure we're doing good on chat. Yeah, okay, cool. We got a lot of good on chat. Great. The infrastructure, security, and services, which is Domain 4, and network infrastructure, which is Domain 1, they basically said they copied and pasted from CCIE route switch. They removed a few topics and didn't add too many topics in here. So that strategy is going to be basically prepare like I'm going for CCIE route switch, and that will cover domains 1 and 4. Again, I already feel pretty comfortable with domain 5 here, the network automation. Oh, another question that I asked, the very last thing right here that I didn't get an answer on again, was configure on-chain subscription using gRPC. gRPC is not the exam topic on InAuto. It's using netconf. So I wanted to verify that it was constrained to gRPC and not just plain old netconf calls. So didn't get an answer on that one. One thing that I did get an answer on, I asked in our Python environment, can we install additional libraries like PyATS? The answer was no. So let me share the screen. Didn't realize my screen wasn't shared there. Sorry, y'all. So I am looking at the blueprint still here. Yeah. So the very last bullet point, I'm talking about this gRPC right there. Yeah, that was the one thing that they didn't really talk about that I was hoping they would talk about. They did talk a lot about EEM. They said you need to know how to configure and script EEM modules, and then how to configure your EEM module to run a Python script upon execution. So I thought that was pretty interesting too. So if I'm just collapsing all of these little bars here again, recapping the domains that are here on the exam blueprint, yeah, I really feel like domains 1 here and domain 4, those are all coming from CCIE route switch. Prepare for CCIE route and switch. The SD-WAN, I certainly feel comfortable that that's ENSDWI. The DNA Center, there's not a whole lot of exam content on DNA Center right now. And we're going to talk about the DNA Center lab and prepping for DNA Center in one moment. There is a textbook coming out that is going to be on DNA Center, and I think that'll be pretty important. I would also love to record some DNA Center content for CVT Nuggets too. The transport technologies, that goes back to that DMVPN thing. It's just troubleshooting DMVPN. FlexVPN is just design. And MPLS, I'm pretty sure, is going to be the deploy, operate, and configure. And then infrastructure and automation, we've kind of already talked about that. So my plan is staying the same at this point. And my number one stressor in all of this preparation was, how do I get hands-on with DNA Center? And they fully acknowledged that. They had an entire slide just to it. They were like, we understand that a lot of people won't be able to get access to DNA Center because it's a dedicated appliance. It's not virtualized at this point. It starts at like $50,000. It goes up to $200,000 depending on the size of the machine. Let me tell you this. With regards to DNA Center, it is possible to virtualize it. If you are in an enterprise and you have DNA Center, I've read about this. I haven't experienced this personally. But your DNA Center appliance gets hosed, corrupted, or whatever. Apparently, Cisco TAC can send you an ISO of the DNA Center image, and then you can spin it up in your own environment and then run it in what's called VM mode. Again, I've not experienced that. I don't know how that works, but apparently people in like Cisco forums have talked about those ways before. So I gotta believe that they're working on some way of automating the deployment of a DNA Center appliance. Now, those things in a virtualized environment. Now, those things are very, very, they require a tremendous amount of resources, so it's probably not the easiest thing to do either. They did say that they are having internal discussions about what is the best way that they can provide DNA Center training that also includes an SD-Access fabric and ISE, because all of those are what's required to make DNA Center work. So you'd have to have Catalyst 9K devices. In fact, the exam environment itself, they did talk about this. Most of it is virtualized with the exception of DNA Center. They actually showed a picture of the Catalyst 9K switches and the DNA Center appliances all racked up, and they said that's what you're going to be using in your lab environment. So it's a hybrid of physical and virtual appliances. The physical appliances are going to be the SD-Access fabric. Yeah, so they are working on ways to get us training tools and methodologies. They suggested both the DevNet Sandbox, which I've already talked about in previous videos, and I said really hard to use the DevNet Sandbox because it's the read-write versions of it. The reservable ones are like chronically reserved. You'd be booking it weeks in advance, and it's not always at the best times of day either. They also suggested looking into dCloud, which I have dCloud pulled up on a different tab right here. I did use this dCloud environment for the in-auto course. Not the best for automation. There were some problems that came along with it. The API responses didn't always provide exactly what I wanted. But from the GUI front end, it was a good way to jump in and get some hands-on practice with the GUI front end. So check out dCloud. Give DevNet Sandbox a try. If you're just clicking around, it may be what you need to get started. And know that Cisco in this webinar said they're actively looking for better ways to get us hands-on DNA Center practice and training. Yeah. So, rest of the week, I have one skill for CBT Nuggets left to record on BGP. That is troubleshooting BGP. I'm hoping to record it tomorrow, edit it Friday, and have BGP behind me. I'm also recording using DNA Center Assurance for recording for CBT Nuggets as part of the NRC course. So, I will finish up my NRC recording this week or early next week, and then I'm shifting heavily into Encore studies so I can knock out the Encore exam and get ready for the CCIE lab. Interesting point. I've had this question come up too on YouTube, and I'm going to point this out now as well. They did say that once you take the Encore exam and pass, you have 3 years from that day to take the lab. So I think before it was 18 months, now it's 3 years. So that's another good point too. Let's see here. Yeah, so Encore's up next. Going to start studying for that hardcore next week. Would love to knock that out quickly. I'm feeling very confident about the exam topics at this point when it comes to Encore, and feeling pretty confident about NRC too, honestly. But I've also heard that NRC is a pretty tough exam, so I want to make sure I've got that covered before I dive into it. Yeah, so that's what I've got today. Impressions here were all pretty interesting stuff. I greatly appreciated Cisco's time and this webinar. I felt like I got a lot of good info out of it. Got some confusing info too. But for the most part, it was 98% good, and felt really much better about my path forward and my strategy and how I'm going to tackle this thing. So let me take a look at some questions that we have here. Don't see many questions, which is cool. Docker is making that person very upset. Docker is a pretty challenging one there too. I definitely understand that. If there are plans to create CCIE content for CBT Nuggets, oh my gosh, I love this question. If I have anything to say about it, the answer there is yes. Yes, how about that? I am knocking out Azure content. I'm recording some Azure content through the summer. So June and July, I'm going to be recording Azure content while I'm studying for Encore. I'm going to knock out Encore, and then I'm going to shift probably early fall. I don't want to set a date because you never know how things go. But early fall, I'm going to say August, maybe September-ish, I'm going to start knocking out SD-WAN, that EN-SDWI content. And my impression here is that if you're familiar with SD-WAN at the EN-SDWI, that's so hard to say, EN-SDWI level, the impression that I got from this webinar was that that's going to be good enough. They were like basic tasks, just show that you know how to use these to implement and operate and optimize like an SD-WAN or an SD-Access infrastructure. So I'm going to say yes to those. Then when it comes to CCIE level routing and services and assurance, man, recording that content would certainly help me out. Or at least peer reviewing Keith Barker's and Jeremy Chara's content on it, and Jeff Kish, he's a CCIE too. That would certainly help me out too. So, yeah, if I have anything to say after it, after I'm done with the SD-WAN course, I would love to do SD-Access and DNA Center, especially at that CCIE level or CCNP level. And then networking and assurance, man, I would love to record that stuff too. So, all depends on how the wind blows in the coming months, but, that's pretty cool. Keith, thank you for the super chat, my friend. I think that's my first super chat. That's really cool. I'll shoot you a message later. How come no one talks about Juniper or Arista these days? That's such a good question, and I love Juniper. When I was in consulting, we were like 98% Juniper networks. So I took all the Cisco exams, but then went and did Juniper network stuff. So Juniper invented network automation, so to speak. They came out with JunoScript in like 2001 and 2002, and that actually laid the foundation for NetConf. A lot of the stuff that NetConf became came from JunoScript, so pretty cool. They were ahead of their time, so to speak. My JNCIA DevOps course is one of my most popular courses, and I loved recording that too. Juniper's also heavily used at the service provider side and not so much on the enterprise side. So that's pretty interesting as well. Good point on that Juniper has free learning. If you do take their practice exam on Junos Genius, you get a voucher to take their exams for free too. So yeah, the JNCIA level search right there. You're exactly right. So, check out the CBT nuggets on the JNCIA DevOps course because put a lot of effort into it, and I like to think that I say these things in plain English. And then go take that little practice exam on the Junos Genius, and you get the free voucher to take the exam for free. The Azure and SD-WAN videos that I've been shooting, they're helpful. I really appreciate that. I do love Azure, and I love SD whatever these days. SD-WAN, SD-Access. I love Meraki. I'm not upset that Meraki's missing from the CCIE, but it does show up like all over the CCNP stuff too. So that's pretty cool. How long till the NARCI course comes out? I don't have a date. It's really hard. So like we record, we upload, and then it's out of our hands. It goes through like a marketing process and then like a polishing process where they make sure descriptions are all right. That can take a few weeks. So we're finishing recording really soon. Like I'm going to be done recording this week or next. And then it may take a little while for the NRC course to come out, not an eternity. I'd love for you to have it like right away. Just know that it's like really close to being done, at least on the recording side of things. So it's not going to be too terribly long after that. Congrats on passing the JNCIS, the ENT. That is awesome. I will say this about Juniper, like if you learn the Cisco commands and you jump on Juniper, it doesn't help you at all. They're different, man. It is wildly different. In Juniper, you can just tell from the moment you start, they were just built with programmability and automation in mind. Like you just do like the show config on Juniper, it looks like just JSON output effectively. Just the whole structure and hierarchy of it is fantastic. Cool. Thank you, Keith, for that comment about the BGP content. So like BGP, it's not that it's hard, it's just that it's big. There's a lot of pieces to it, and it's very easy like to start talking about a topic and then go down a rabbit hole really quick. It's like, oh, well, if you do this, then you could do this, but then you could do that too. But then you could do this over here. And I wanted to make sure that I broke this BGP content down into little digestible pieces. So you watch 5 minutes, you've done a task, and you feel good about it. Then you can watch another 5 minutes, and you've done a task, and you feel good about that, and we've added on to it just a little bit. Then you watch another 5 minutes, we've performed another task, and maybe you don't feel as good about that, but I didn't go down too far of a rabbit hole, so you can just watch 5 minutes over again. You know what I mean? So all of the BGP content, I diced it up in a way that at least made sense to me. Like if I were watching this content, this is the content that I would want to watch when it comes to BGP. So if you already know BGP, you may start watching it and go, well, what about this? They're like, don't worry, we're going to get to it. Right now, we're just taking things one small step at a time so that by the time you're done watching the BGP content, you've started from BGP Hello World and made your way to like, whoa, we've filtered out routes, we've summarized, we've manipulated the best path algorithm, we've gone through all the best path attributes and seen how route maps can be applied, like all of it where you can just like, I'm already going down a rabbit hole right now, you see? I made this content so that like anyone who's never touched BGP could end up going like, I'm going to pass this part of the test. So I appreciate that. Doesn't mean that it's perfect. Doesn't mean that it Keith's going to record it and say, well, you could say this. And I hope he does, because I do appreciate feedback from my peers and the experts in the industry. But yeah, I really put forth a lot of effort into this BGP stuff just to make sure that it was truly digestible. So I appreciate that comment, and I hope that y'all who watch it will feel the same way. If someone wants to prepare for the CCIE lab, what computer specs would you suggest for EVE-NG? Phenomenal question. So I'll tell you, I am running my EVE-NG environment on a Dell R710 server. And check this out. Look, hey, look, eBay.com. Right now, Dell R710 is really old. I'm going to get to the actual computer specs itself, but I just want to show you that this exists. Dell R720s are out there. Yeah, so here's two 6-core processors, 32 gigs of RAM. Here's a 64 gig of RAM. 12 cores, is that what that says? That's cool. So that's a hoss of a server right there for 365. But see, it's got these 2.5-inch bays, and that makes it really, really complicated to use. Or, you'd have to use SAS drives, which are really expensive. I like to search for Dell R720 3.5. Look at this right here. Here's a 3.5-inch bay server, two 6-core processors, 64 gigs. That's it. That's what I would buy right there if I had the space for a server. You would have to provide your own storage, so you'd have to go out and buy drives. And if you bought like SSDs with 2.5-inch drives, you'd have to buy a little adapter for those tray caddies. But you can buy those on Amazon for like $5. But this is basically what I'm using now. This is just the R710 is what I'm using, the older version of it. You install ESXi on it for free, and then I install EVE-NG on that. So my EVE-NG server, it's almost exactly like this. It's 12 cores and 64 gigs. I gave mine 24 vCPUs, because there's 24 threads on the server, and 48 gigs of RAM. You do not need to use that much horsepower unless you're getting into things like firepower appliances or vManage emulation. Those are actual servers that it's emulating, and those things can require like 8 gigs of RAM and 4 cores just to run that one appliance. Then you've got to run the vBond, the vSmart, the vEdges, or firepower threat devices, the next-gen IPS, and so on. So for just like the regular old iOS images, like the iOS V Layer 3 and Layer 2, I mean, it's like 1 core and 1 gig of RAM, and it's not even really using that. So you can put like a ton of those devices on a topology and run it with very little specs. So if you are going to run it on your local computer, you can run it using VMware Workstation. Honestly, like 4 cores and 8 gigs of RAM is probably enough to run a small topology. 8 cores and 16 gigs of RAM would be preferred. And then if you got even more than that, even better. I understand a lot of people, it's hard to like come up with the cache too. That's a very real thing. When I was getting started, this is not advice. Do not take this as advice. This is my personal experience when I was getting started. When I was getting started and I was below the poverty line, I was broke, I was poor. You can watch my video. It's one of the very first videos I ever uploaded. I was really struggling. I took out a credit card and put all this stuff on credit card and just went into debt and paid that stuff off over years. Because my thought was it cost money to make money. So, again, I'm not advising you to get a credit card and take out debt, but that was my experience with it. So, yeah. So that's what I'm using. If you probably can't even hear it. It's not that loud. It does generate a little bit of heat, but it's sitting about 5-6 feet away from me. Right, this is a small room, and this is if you actually watch my DevNet course and stuff, I'm recording an Ubuntu machine. It's actually just the console of an Ubuntu VM that I have running on that server. So, and then my VIA role in that instance was just connected through a port group on ESXi. Now EVE-NG is connected through a port group that goes out to my physical LAN, and that's how I use Ansible. Oh man, that was a question I should have asked. If there would be Ansible on the exam. I guess not, because it's not a bullet point. Oh well. Cool. So, what else we got here? Yeah, let me see. What is your plan to tackle SD-Access and SD-WAN from a lab point of view? And how much did my setup cost in total? Let me talk about SD-Access and SD-WAN. Still kicking ideas around on DNA Center and SD-Access. Right now, like if I were to have to start studying it today, I would fire up DevNet Sandbox Always On or dCloud and just start clicking around and hope I find something that works. Otherwise, I'm probably going to have to go to my employer and be like, hey, what's my budget like? So that's one thing. SD-WAN, if you have a valid license or your Cisco account has access, the correct permissions to download the QCOW images, the little virtualized images, you can import those into CML or EVE-NG. So my plan is to acquire those images in the most legal and legit way possible, import them, and then practice in EVNG for that. How much did my setup cost me in total? Well, that's been a moving target over years. For networking, I'll just limit it to say like it probably cost me $500 for the server and storage, and then like the EVNG license. But like when I got my MCSE, that, you know, I had multiple servers because I had to make a failover cluster. And you know, probably at the time that was running, I'd probably spent about $2,000. I even have like a little Synology down here that was used as my iSCSI target. So that way I had shared storage between the servers. Let me tell you about this, y'all. The CCIE, right now where I'm standing in the CCIE, my journey, I was planning on saying this on Friday. I'm going to say it now. I'm standing at the foot of a mountain, looking up this mountain, thinking, got to start somewhere, got to take one step at a time. Eventually, one step after another, you make it to the top of the mountain. The MCSE, in many ways, was exactly like that. It took me about 15 months to get my MCSE. If I look at the amount of content that was on the MCSE versus the CCIE, I'd argue there's actually more content on the MCSE than there were on the CCIE. Difference, of course, being the MCSE was 4 exams, whereas the CCIE was 1. So we're not comparing apples to apples here unless we're just talking about just the raw amount of content or the amount of mountain that I have to traverse. So I'm looking at the CCIE. I am intimidated in the sense that I know it's going to be a very difficult exam. A lot of people fail it. But I'm not intimidated by the amount of work I have to do because I've already done this before. I mean, really, my entire career has been climbing a mountain. The MCSE so far has been the biggest mountain. DevNet Professional was probably the second biggest mountain, or very comparable in size. How can you legally obtain those images from Cisco? You or your employer have to purchase the equipment with the correct support. Maybe reach out to CDW and ask them what kind of licensing you need to make this happen. There are vEdge devices. I think it's like the VB100 or something. It's only like $200 or $300, but I don't know if that entitles you to like the vManage, vSmart, or vBond licensing. I have reached out to other like CDW or people at Cisco and asked them like, what is the minimum amount that I have to buy to legally get these images? And no one's replied to me yet. So basically, I'm going to go to my employer and be like, "Hey, we already have like some sort of relationship with Cisco. Let's buy this stuff." There you go. Someone answers a good question there. Thank you. Let's see. What else do we have here? Yeah, they did not announce any easy solutions for labbing up the SD components. I'll agree to that. The SD-WAN reservable DevNet sandbox, I've not had any troubles with that, and they are rolling out a new SD-WAN reservable sandbox too. So I am significantly less stressed about SD-WAN because I've had no issues reserving that sandbox and getting hands-on experience with vManage. Much more stressed about DNA Center. When I was recording DNA Center content for Inato, Encore, and DevAsk, and soon to be NRC, I really struggled to find a way to do that because seemingly the only way I can get access to DNA Centers with is always-on sandboxes that are read-only. So actually getting access to a DNA Center instance where I could make a change, like a post request in automation, the only place I was able to do that was dcloud. But the dcloud API was effectively broken, meaning the GET request where I get data back first, they didn't really ever return anything accurately. So, you know, hit or miss. I can either get accurate requests from the always-on sandbox, or I can post accurate requests with dcloud, but I can't do both. So yeah, still a little stressed about SD-Access and DNA Center, but less stressed because they were like, it's not as hard as you think it may be. They're like, know it at the basic level. What other questions do we have here? I appreciate the dialogue in the chat. This was a great discussion. I appreciate the questions too, and I appreciate your time in joining me. Oh, here's a good question. Why wouldn't you have advertised your YouTube channel via others like Keith Barker and Chuck or David Bombal? You know what? I'm not there yet. Like, I'm still trying to, like, make an identity or a name for myself in this whole, like, training world. I've been with CBT Nuggets now for a year and a half. I've only been doing this in RC stuff is the first networking content that I've actually trained on. I've actually recorded. I've been doing networking for like years. That was where I actually got my start. My tech career start was networking. But since joining CBT Nuggets, I did a lot of data like business intelligence, SQL Server, did some A plus and Net plus content, did Azure developer, so a lot of C sharp content there for them. Then I shifted heavily into network automation, a lot of Python there. Haven't actually taught anything in networking now until in RC. So I'm still like trying to find my footing, just trying to get my name out there. Didn't want to necessarily advertise just yet until like I've got, I don't know. I guess I don't have a great excuse for it. I just kind of wanted to focus on doing my own thing, recording my own content, and making CBT Nuggets my top priority. That's a great question. Somebody also recently asked me why I don't have Teespring and I'm not selling merch. Literally, it never even crossed my mind until that person pinged it to me. I think it was like Thursday of last week. So maybe that's something I want to dig into. I love this question from James Harris. Who even runs SD-Access? I've never seen it in the real world, and I support lots of customers. That's a great point. Not many people are running SD-Access yet, and if you post on like Reddit communities like CCIE, the ones that are running SD-Access are doing it at a very limited scale. So if you buy a Catalyst 9K device, you are required to buy a DNA Center license. There's 3 tiers of DNA Center license. I can't remember what they're exactly called. I know it's like Basic, something, and Premier, maybe. You're required to buy one of them, doesn't matter which one. So a lot of these environments are buying Catalyst 9K devices, which run iOS XE and NetConf. Maybe they're not implementing SD-Access. They're not replacing their infrastructure with SD-Access. So they only implement it in a small scale just to test it out. They don't trust it with their whole network yet, and they're just getting acclimated to it. This also goes down to the fact that there's not much training on it, and there's not much like ways to lab it and practice with it. And you don't want to just like roll out DNA Center and then like rip out your infrastructure and then put DNA Center in there and hope it works, right? So a lot of people are just trying to ease into it before they can get a lab or practice environment in it. I've heard mixed reviews about it, good or bad. So that's I would ask that question in the subreddit for Cisco and the subreddit for CCIE. That question does come up a lot. Just SDN and programmability minutes to wait for the training to access those topics are being worked out. We have plenty to learn and practice till then. Look, I can tell you, we've got a lot of SDN and programmability when it comes to the Inato and DevAsk course, and it touched on it a little bit in the Encore course too at CBT Nuggets. So if you want to get ready for the programmability portion of the CCIE, I mean, I'm looking at these blueprints right here. I'm telling you, almost all of this is covered in our like EEM applets covered in Encore. Guest shell and EEM and these modules covered in DevAsk. Programmability is covered in Inato and DevAsk. Model-driven telemetry is covered in Inato, but not with gRPC. I believe the exam blueprint there called for NetConf. But really, almost every single one of these bullet points, if not every single one of these bullet points, is covered on CBT Nuggets currently. SD stuff. Jeff Kish covered SD-WAN really well in Encore, and we are going to record that SD-WAN course later this year, probably this fall. The DNA Center stuff, I did my best to highlight the 4 workflows of DNA Center in Encore. There were no configuration changes when I did it, but I did illustrate what the design portion of DNA Center does, what the policy portion of DNA Center does, what the provision portion of DNA Center does, and what the assurance portion of DNA Center does. We open up a GUI, we click through it, we see how everything works. So if you've never seen DNA Center before, the Encore course has a skill called, I think it was like implement enterprise networks using the DNA Center workflows. That's your starting point right there. And I can't recommend that enough. That was a lot of fun to shoot. Yeah. So when does my MCSE expire? I don't know that it does expire. Let's bring up LinkedIn and find out. I think the new MCSEs were perpetual. We can bring up LinkedIn and we can just check. I've got the acclaim tagged on my certification. LinkedIn is so slow right now. Y'all see this, right? Let's go to my profile. Yeah, I got that shirt yesterday too. I was really excited about that. They did remove the verbs too. You're right, James. They removed verbs, but also kept verbs in some places too, which I thought was peculiar. Like in transport, here they explicitly said troubleshoot DMVPN, and here they explicitly said identify use cases. So when I look at MPLS and I don't see any verbs, that's how I know it's going to be deploy, operate, optimize. All right, cool. Now I've got this up. We can go down to the MCSC. There it is right there, cloud platform. See credential. Yeah, I don't think there's an expiration on this thing. Cool. All right, that's cool. All right, back to the CCIE. Let me bring up my chat real quick. Yeah, I mean, the verbs would have certainly helped me too, figure out like how much I need to stress about things. But if there's no verbs, that means I just need to know it all. So, this is the CCIE we're talking about. Not going to make any excuses for myself. Got to learn it all. If I don't learn it all, I'm not going to pass. And not passing is also okay. Just don't give up. That's the most important part. All right. Not seeing any more questions, so I am going to wrap up there. Again, I cannot thank you all enough for joining me in this journey. Talk to you again on Friday. Let you know how the BGP recording wrapped up and how that went. That's all definitely counting towards my CCIE journey. Next week, finishing my NRC recording and digging into Encore. Can't wait to talk to y'all about that. So thanks for stopping by, y'all. I'll see you in the next one.